Well, happy Wednesday, everybody. I'm Tom Strange, curator for the keyboards for Sigal Music Museum, and today I want to talk a little bit about the square pianos that we have in the collection. We're going to mostly cover some instruments that Marlowe Sigal had collected from the 1970s through the very last square piano that he ever purchased. And we will, on Friday, we'll probably cover a little bit more depth on some of the later squares that we have. But let's talk about the square piano in general just to start off with. So I think it would be a little bit over the top to say that the piano only became popular because of the square piano. But I don't think it's unfair to say that the square piano had a great deal to do with making the piano a very, very popular instrument indeed, and in fact accelerating its growth over just about any musical instrument of its time to the point where it almost became a mania. So I would be remiss if I didn't point out a few key individuals that have certainly helped me and my understanding of these pianos. David Hackett in the UK with his Friends of Square Pianos website was just a profound influence on many of us because he invited the conversations that took place that allowed us to sort of explore what these pianos meant and all the variety and diversity that came out in these pianos. And he continues to do that. So if you never have, go check out the Friends of Square Pianos website. Very valuable information there. I have a sister website called Square Piano Tech that allows you to have a repository for some of the information about restoring the pianos and maybe a little bit of the data that it's a little bit too minute to perhaps publish, but it's just right for those kind of formats. So big shout out to David Hackett, also of course to Graham Walker, a great restorer in the UK and who now has been vending the leathers and cloths that I use and other people have been using. So the shout out to Graham Gadd, who with his book, The British Art Piano, just encouraged us all to kind of take a breath and go spend some time thinking about pianos. David Hunt, wonderful restorer, David Winston, Michael Cole, the historian. All of these people have come together to really help us, the person who wanted to know more about these pianos, but perhaps live in America, where it is more difficult to find information about such things, and certainly to encounter such instruments here in America. Outside of the museums, it's fairly uncommon. And so we're going to start off with what I think is everybody pretty much now agrees is the genesis of the square piano. In the earlier part of the 20th century, we tended to think that the square piano must have come out of Germany, and in fact there were a few contenders that said that they were the earliest of the square pianos still around. But all of them have a problem of one kind or another. Either the provenance doesn't hold up, or when you examine the instrument, there's elements of it that just don't seem to fit the time frame that we're talking about, or things have obviously been added or altered that made the date look earlier. I think we can generally agree that sometime in late 1765 or early 1766, a fairly enterprising gentleman by the name of John Zumpe, who Latinized his name on his name boards to Johannes Zumpe, but Johann, or John Zumpe, as he was known in London, had been working with Schutte making harpsichords and had left over just about the time John Broadwood joined Schutte. Then Zumpe leaves the firm and begins making English guitars. From there, he brings forward this wonderful instrument, the first square piano in 1766. We have 4 examples from that first year still extant, and they show a fair amount of variation that allows you to believe that perhaps the instrument is very much still evolving as that year goes on. After 1766, a little more uniformity, but the one thing about Zumpy pianos is that as the date goes forward, the piano typically gets larger and typically gets a little more sophisticated in the way it's designed and built. The very earliest ones were quite plain instruments without much in the way of any elaborate decoration, typically a plain mahogany case and a little bit of dark stringing, and that was all that he did. And he was selling them at a very low price point, roughly 20 pounds, or shall we say 20 guinea at the time, roughly that sort of price range. This one from 1770 that Marlowe bought is a little more elaborate. In fact, of the Zumpy pianos that haven't been specifically taken and set into some sort of a royal case, there's one in Russia that's just absolutely fantastic, but probably began its life as a more conventional Zumpy piano. But this one has some fairly nice marquetry inlay in the corners, little decorative elements. The stringing is more elaborate than usual, and the whole instrument just presents as a little bit finer. I have a feeling that this one was made for somebody in particular, and they had made a request, and Zumpy is filling the request and making a very interesting piano while he does it. I'm working on this piano at the moment because it has otherwise been restored and it's in pretty good shape. With these early pianos, we often have little problems, and in this case, the little problem is that something has shifted back here between the two layers of wood that make up the hitch pin block in the back here, and so the holes for the dampers have actually shifted, if you can see, sort of like that. It's pinching the dampers off a little bit, and we're going to find out exactly what's going on in this one, and then we'll set it back to the correct way. And I think after that, this piano will be quite a nice instrument. But as with all these very, very early pianos, extremely light hammerheads and the English single action, which I'll show you in a second, and then so no dampers at the moment because, as I say, I'm working on the dampers, but let me show you a little bit. The damper mechanisms on these things are in two parts. On the top layer, if you can see here clearly, we have a rail, and on this rail are these little bits projecting out, and those little bits are whalebone. And the whalebone is acting as a spring, and these bits press down on the top of each damper and presses it down so that you have some reasonable damping action. I will set that under there. And then here are the dampers themselves. And so these are all over lever type dampers. And projecting from each damper is a captive whalebone sticker. And that sticker comes up through a hole. So the back of the key grabs this and pushes it up, and that's what makes the damper come up off the string. And as I say, what's happening now is that we've got some interference between this sticker and the wood in the back. So we'll fix that up, and then the dampers will move freely again. I want to keep those over to the side here because I don't want the parchment to be stressed too much. And then laying over this, a rail across the top here that would act to keep the dampers from sort of flying up on our face. So as Zumpy evolved, one of the things that happened is that his rather plain instruments took on a little more decoration. Here is a name board from 1778 that goes to one of our other pianos, and as you can see, mostly what he's done is put in some burl wood as a background, and then he has his name planchet inlaid. In this case, we have Zumpy and Buntabart. So Gabriel Buntabart is working with Zumpy in London, worked with Zumpy from 1768 until 1778, and then they had an amicable split, Buntebart went off to build pianos under his own name, and Zumpy would work with the instruments another couple of years from 1778 and then turn it over to Horne, who would then take the firm on from there. So, Zumpy enjoying life. This piano is about 56 inches long. By the time we get to 1778, they're about 59 inches long. And then the instrument would continue to grow. For a 5-octave instrument, 62 inches to 64 inches is something for the larger ones to be thinking about. So, 1770, on a little trestle stand, one of the nice early Zumpy pianos with a nice early sound, and in this case, needing only to have its damper stickers freed so that it can make music again. Let's come down and look at another one. So here's an interesting instrument by another fellow German. This is by George Karka, 1789. Karka began building sometime after Zumpy. Zumpy was, as we said, the first, and then Johann Pullman comes in and begins building. By 1768, Pullman is making his first pianos, much like a copy of a Zumpy, probably at Zumpy's request. Frederick Beck would come in, Adam Bayer, and Christopher Goddard in the 1770s, making these square pianos. Karka came in just a little bit later, and then by 1789, Karka is starting to enter a period of ill health, and so it wouldn't be a long time before Karka actually passes away after building this. I bring this instrument forward. This was not part of the Marlowe-Sigal collection. It's one that was donated to us recently, but I wanted it for a really simple reason. Because Marlowe's collection was so extensive, we have instruments from just about all the early builders that were out there. Karka was one that we didn't have a representation for, and when you look inside, although this instrument needs everything, it's sort of a kit piano at the moment, looks a great deal like the way Zumpy is laying things out all throughout, even 20 years later. So let's just, we just need to mention for a moment that, the inventive power for Zumpy on this type of instrument was just striking. He has taken a clavichord sort of background, and it's laid out very much like one of the German clavichords or Swiss clavichords, but he's done some very different things. He's increased the strength of the bottom board. He's increased the thickness of the strings, which was very smart. He has invented this action that is comprised of these little hammers, and let's see, I have one that's free here. So these wonderful little hammers are hit from below as the key is depressed. An old man's head comes up and hits the bass right about here, and as it does, it throws the hammer up in the air, and then the hammer comes down. There's a little slot with a wire through it, and that keeps the hammer guided through its travel so it's not flopping about. By the end of the 18th century, we've actually increased the whole size of the hammers, the hammer shanks, the width of the base of the hammer, to the point where, with a reasonable leather, we don't actually need these slotted holes anymore, and so these go away with time. But this idea of a hammer with leather hinges sitting there popping against the string would last until the 1850s. In America, we even find them into the 1860s. So an idea that lasted 100 years, well into the development of the piano, certainly is something to be crowing about. And to bring all of this inventive power together at once, must have been fairly spectacular for the time. So, George Karka, Zumpy, Beck, Bayer, you're starting to get the idea that there's a lot of German-sounding names here, and in fact there are. I want to go into this in some depth later in the year when we can talk about the myth of the 12 apostles. But the whole idea of the myth of the 12 apostles, as promoted by Rimbaud, was that 12 Germans came as one party into London and taught everybody how to make pianos that they had already learned from building them in Germany. Of course, the myth is that none of that's true. They didn't come as one party, and they probably didn't bring the information for the piano from anywhere. It sprang up with Zumpe in London and then caught fire. So, but it makes for an interesting tale, and it allows us to think about that band of piano makers as something of a group, which is was so influential that when other instruments came into being examined and looked at, there's something of a desire to, well, why can't we make it by one of those builders that we know so well? And that's the next piano that I want to show you. So here we are back. We're going to talk about this little piano now. This one is very, very interesting in that it purports to be a Christopher Goddard square piano with very unusual curved ends for the case and a very, very much smaller aspect ratio than English square pianos would have had at the time. And when Marlowe bought it, I'm sure that he thought it was a very unusual version of a Christopher Goddard piano. As we have had time to examine it, then we know that there's nothing about Christopher Goddard about this piano. It was made by someone, and it wasn't made poorly, but it wasn't made by Goddard. So Goddard was one of the better builders, along with Adam Bayer. Marlowe already had a Christopher Goddard piano, so he would have known what he was looking at. And he had many questions as he was looking at this himself. Ultimately, I think he decided that, in fact, it was something of a chimerical beast. Most museums have these, and they're valuable teaching aids in themselves because it's a way of understanding what people put value on and where they would find inspiration even later, hundreds of years later in this case. So what we have here is an instrument that was heavily worked over by a D.H. Wilkins and Hasselmer, part of the Dolmetsch organization. And by 1960, Arnold, of course, is gone, but the organization under Carl is still going, and restoring instruments was one of the things that they did. And this one likely passed through their shops. We can raise the lid on this, and when we do, what we find is even more interesting questions. So in the back, clearly laid out for being a monochord, one string per note throughout the compass, and yet there are two pins for on the nut and on the bridge for strings. So exactly what have we got here? In fact, I take that back. The bridge is the interesting part because it only has pins for one string, but the nut has pins for two. So I suspect that whatever happened to this one, the bridge has actually been changed out as well as everything else. You could ask, well, Tom, what about this isn't a Christopher Goddard? Well, the fact that nothing on the inside looks anything like him, and we know that Wilkins added these dampers because he says so. We look at the name board, and something about it doesn't quite fit. The wood on the name board does not match the wood on the keywell cheeks. There's banding around the keywell cheeks. There's no banding on the name board. Everything looks sort of altered and wrong. There's an angled piece here for the name board to fit into originally, and it's not being made use of at all. So the name board can come out. Like this. And when we do that, we see that the bottom has been shaved off fairly recently. We can see that the edges have been chamfered differently than what was original. This obviously cut in at a later date to allow the bass string to come around and not bang against the board. So in all ways, shapes, and forms, we look at it and say, okay, without the name board, would you have ever guessed goner? And the answer is no, you wouldn't, not a bit of it. And so we know this isn't a goner. The question is, what is this? And so I'm hoping that some of you out there will give it a thought, and then let's see what we come back with. While I can't say that I see any holes for an overdamper system to begin with, I can also say that there is some sort of a new layer of wood here that got us back to one pin for one string per note, and that this does not look to be as old as it should. But as with these early pianos, there's always question, and there's always the concern of, are you oversimplifying? Have you missed something? So we're going to spend a little more time on this in the future, looking for other witness marks, details, and clues that might give us an idea of not only what was this originally disposed as, and then maybe later, who could have actually been the contender for having built this? We don't really know. It's interesting to have a piano like this that has so many questions around it. And what we have here is a wonderful instrument by Adam Beyer himself, 1775. Very nice early square piano, and in every way, shape, and form, this one, at least, is a good contender for being Beyer. In fact, we know that it's made by him. Characteristic brasses, throughout, and then the layout of the instrument, quite understandable. In this case, we have the little chord in the back. So if you look on the left-hand side of any of these instruments, you'll see a set of levers, and these levers are for raising and lowering the dampers, and also a buff stop in the back. So with the damper in, the buff rises up, and then as you play it, rather than get a full sounding string, you get a little thump, 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 thump. So very interesting sound, and then we can raise and lower these dampers independently. The treble comes up here, and the bass comes up here, and so it gives you a lot of tone and color control for the piano as you're playing it. Now, I would play this piano for you, except for one problem. As with so many of these, one of the evils that have fallen on this piano is that the rest plank here in the back, underneath these tuning pins, has separated from the bottom boards. The glue has gotten old, and the old glue is coming apart, and in fact, if I were to push hard on this, you can feel it shifting up and down. So it's shifting up and down because, in fact, the soundboard needs to come out. We'll restring it at that time. This one was restored again back in the 1960s. The restoration is questionable as far as the strings that they used, and yet the piano still tries to sound very nice, even though it's clearly got some difficulties. So we're going to bring this one back to life, I think, in time. An excellent example, again, of one of these very, very early pianos from the beginning of the square piano era. We have this nice instrument, and this one by Germain, Jacques Germain, is part of a harpsichord building dynasty. There aren't a lot of examples left of his harpsichords, and the Met has a harpsichord that was turned into a piano. This is the only surviving piano that we know about. Case decorations possibly done later than 1782 when this piano was built in Paris. Because it's Parisian, Paris pianos and Italian pianos would be more likely to have picked up, these kind of paint decorations, and to be a little more, visually decorative and interesting than the traditional London piano. But on the inside, within the keywell, it follows a pretty conventional look for a piano from 1782. And then once again, I think this one has been restored, and with a little work should be a fairly superior instrument. I don't see any difficulties within it. And the last square piano from the Sigal collection, I want to talk about this one from America. So this one, made by Horne and Babcock in Milton, just outside of Boston. And it's kind of the quintessential American piano, and I say that because it's making use of American materials and an American style and design approach, heavily influenced by what was going on in London, and yet of their own accords and styles. The name board with the painted flowers looks a lot like those painted flower name boards that we see with early Clementi pianos. But the style of the decoration here is entirely different than what Clementi was doing, and it would definitely be its own artistic style. In this case, we even know the artist who made the painting. In the back, there's an inscription that says, please paint and varnish this very nicely. Can you have it done in 10 days? And it went to the shop of Peterman, who was a watercolorist and gouache painter. And in fact, we have watercolor and gouache decorations here, and then the name board varnished over after that more delicate material was put down. This has lasted very well. It still looks quite nice, and it's only one of many elements of a very interesting sort of piano. So in many ways, this instrument is it's built around 1805 to 1810, and yet with the lever over dampers in the back and the 5-octave compass and the layout of the bridge and such, it's more evocative of an instrument that would have been from maybe 1790 to 1795 than 1805. A little bit out of date, and we find that in American pianos quite frequently, where the builders have come over, but they're building against a tradition that they knew when they left. With Crehor, he would have picked it up from instruments that he had encountered from earlier. He was an American. The poplar music stand in the back, this would have been made of mahogany in all London pianos, but in this case I suspect that mahogany was a dear material, and so we've grabbed some service wood and made a poplar version of that. We have used mahogany for the damper rack in the back, and then I have posted a picture earlier, but these dampers are very, very interesting. I've never seen an approach quite like this, and we'll talk about that on Facebook. So have a look when you get a chance, and let me know what you think of that. What does such a piano sound like? Well, in this case, the instrument was restored carefully by Tim Hamilton. This was the last piano that Marlowe bought in 2009. And so if we play just a little snippet. And I noticed some of the treble hammers are perhaps just a bit bright, and they might have a little dust and grime on the top of them. But I really like this piano, and I think from an understanding of the early American style and aesthetic, that this is a really interesting piano for people. So I hope you have enjoyed our little tour of some of the square pianos in the Sigal Musical Instrument Collection. We'll come back to you again with some additional pianos, and keep tuning in. Thank you.